Hi and welcome back. So today I wanted to show my first patches on Serum of 2025. I got my keyboard and stuff here, but don't let that fool you because I am not a keyboardist whatsoever. But I do know how to use my fingers and hit keys, so that's what I'm going to be doing to show these patches that I made. So I have two patches so far, and they're both also in the kind of lo-fi circle, I guess. Lately I've been trying to make synths that are a little more pleasant and soft to the ear, but ironically they also have distortion, so it's kind of an interesting balance to get that crunchy distortion in a pleasant way. But don't get me wrong, normally I love really abrasive synthesis, like any frequency collision between AM, FM, RM, all that good stuff. But you can only drone for so long before you got to do something else, right? So anyway, this patch right here I'll be making available for download, and it is going to demonstrate some of the benefits that I mentioned in one of my rants about synthesis, where my wavetables at the wavetable level will introduce a large amount of what influences the patch, rather than just having random wavetables with unrelated frequencies and then sculpting that down into something more coherent. In this case, the wavetables are actually a great starting point, and I've made these wavetables for you guys as a pair, so that way you can make your own patches with this exact setup. So as you can see here, I have modern VCO1 and modern VCO2. And essentially, as long as you have both of these in this configuration, they will be slightly different from each other. So when you hard pan them left and right, you'll get a related but yet different sound from each side, thus a stereo image. And yeah, basically the table itself, actually let me open up a empty Serum for you guys to demonstrate the wavetable by itself. Okay, so here's the wavetables. I plan on doing another video soon, going more into the topic of wavetables and how I like to use them, because that topic alone can get pretty deep on what waveforms and what wave shapes are associated to certain sound. And really the only way that I can explain that is for you to hear it in real time and share the exact same experience versus trying to put words to it. Perhaps there are like scientific words I could put to it, but really I just don't know. So without that definition, the best way for me is to just demonstrate it. But anyway, a small snippet of what I'll be sharing later is a type of wavetable I have called tone mod tables. And essentially I got that idea way back when I got the DeepMind 12, Behringer's first synth. I couldn't resist having a historical synth that had a mind-blowing amount of features for the price tag, especially because at the time, in order to get a polysynth with all of those features, it would have costed astronomically more than I can afford. So I went for it, and honestly, I don't really use it as much. It's a really great synth, but I feel like the oscillators inside there sound kind of plasticky and don't give me that bright clashing overtone that I prefer from my modular rig. But of course, obviously it's a polysynth, so you know, can't really complain. At the end of the day, I feel like it doesn't have any more advantage over Serum. Serum saw waves actually sound a lot brighter to me than the saw waves in the DeepMind 12. But anyway, that was sort of off topic. My point was that it basically has a wave shaper that gives you some subtle variations on the square waves, and I have essentially like a group of wavetables that take from that concept, where the tables are just wave shapes that as you modulate them, you can get a ton of various phenomenon, ranging from the illusion of width, like I demonstrated in my other video, and even other things like spectral balance shifting or harmonic blending. But anyway, let's just look at this table for now. So in this table, you get everything you need from the basic wave shapes except for a sine wave, even though it may not look like it. Right here, you basically have a saw wave. Even though there's a lot going on in this shape, the waveform is mostly asymmetrical, which you can tell just by tracing the mouse like this through the entire table. And so you're gonna get kind of like a saw wave, asymmetrical, buzzy, even harmonic kind of sound. Yeah, so I'm not really a keyboardist, but anyway, you could tell it sounds pretty much like the DeepMind, in my opinion, where it's a saw wave, but it has that kind of square plastickiness, and that's due to the fact that it does have this symmetry going on. So anyway, as we sweep through the table, we'll get these other shapes right here, which are actually more saw, in my opinion, but on the darker side of the spectrum, so the brightness is basically gone. So anyway, as we sweep through, we'll get these harmonics kind of pinching and also at the same time closing in on each other, which will create that kind of flange-ish effect that I demonstrated also in my other rant video about synthesis. Essentially, when you have like those spikes in any type of waveform, that moment where that spike is happening, all of the frequencies are kind of going off at the same time because they're all aligned in phase and happening so quickly that you kind of just get like a sharp buzziness, right? And anytime you have that, no matter what your waveform looks like, what's in the middle, if there's those spikes happening at points in your wave, and if they're related and move together and not kind of like randomly, your mind will pick up the fact that they are either closing in or drifting apart, especially if it's in a symmetrical way, like a lot of my wavetables have been designed, because that is really a feature that when you're automating it, you get two benefits. One of them is that when you automate it with, say, like a regular triangle LFO, like the default one, at a faster rate, wavetables that have like a fixed point, the other point will move like this, you'll get that detuning effect like I demonstrated with the pulse width modulation in my other synthesis video. But when you have them like this and it's going like this within the window of specifically Serum, because remember, the window of the oscillator is an actual frequency itself. That is the main frequency happening, and the data within it is just cycling at a repetition, so you hear it as frequency. But when you have those points drifting apart and back together, especially at a fast rate, technically the waveform is detuning up and down at the same time, but yet it's happening within that window, so it's happening at a fixed frequency. And so you get really that first benefit of modulation and it not detuning. And then the second benefit is just the flange-ish effect that you can get when you have slow automation, like an LFO, right? In that case of slow automation, you can have a fixed point and have the other point drift off left and right, and you won't really notice a pitch change or anything like that. It won't be an issue like it is at a faster rate. But why not have it symmetrical, and then now you can use fast modulation and slow modulation. So I designed a lot of my wavetables to have that feature, so that way they are usable in more cases and you don't have to really go searching through long lists of random wavetables before you find something that is going to fit the needs of the patch you're going for. So anyway, if you look here, those points will actually drift all the way into each other and totally cancel out and disappear. From there, we get another saw dominant type of wave like this. And then when you sweep this way, you get kind of a triangle coming in, but in a spectral way. It's not like crossfading in through amplitude, it's actually coming in spectrally. And so it's not really obvious all the time when you're looking at it in a window like this, but from here, this point to this point is a spike. So you're gonna get that buzziness like a saw. And in this case, this waveform has two spikes in it, so it has square properties as well. So anyway, now let's hear the wavetable being sweeped. There's a lot of room there for very cool automation, all the way from making hard bass or just soft kind of synth keys or even pads, you know, it depends on what you want. And we will get into a lot of those topics in future videos too. I do want to try and start mapping out how I can fit these things into topics, because really in my mind it's all just one big cloud. It's kind of hard to put it into topics. But if there's like an end goal, like if you're trying to make like pads, for example, then that kind of narrows it down for me and it helps me like, okay, now I can talk about everything associated with pads. But that's the trick about synthesis though, is that all of the ingredients and components that would go into making a pad are shared information that can be usable in other places. Like for example, perhaps the wavetables that I would use in a pad can also be useful in a monophonic drone or some kind of audio rate modulation or something like that. I guess I'll just keep going at it for now, and maybe these videos will get better as I keep practicing. But looking at this wavetable, there is a lot of room room for patching. And on top of that, we get a second wavetable to accompany it. Now this wavetable is basically exactly the same, except for the fact that the transition between these are not happening at the same linear rate. They're kind of like skewed, so that way the wavetable is going to have slight differences from the left table. And on top of that, the ending has an entirely new section of wave shapes. So if we look at the first wavetable, it ends kind of at this point here, and this one will actually also reach this point, but notice here that there is that much more on the wavetable position knob. And in this case, those points that were drifting from each other, which are no longer spikes, they are, I'm not sure if this is the right word, but they're like transfer curves or something like that. Basically, it's just not a spike. It is now like decaying energy. And so when you have them do that drifting apart effect, they don't have the high frequency flanger kind of combing in the frequency spectrum like when they're spikes. Instead, only the lower information, like kind of the bass, will comb through each other. So you kind of get more of like a bass width illusion kind of thing happening. So if I put this at like a lower octave or something and turn off the other oscillator. Yeah, so you get that kind of like bassiness, especially if you put a filter and just take out the brightness. The brightness is coming from the spike at the edge of the waveform here that's off of the window. The edges of the window itself is the spike, where this point right here is reaching this point. But if we put a filter on that, this has been one of my favorite discoveries in synthesis, and I don't know how many other people have discovered the same thing, but usually from what I see, the most common way for people to achieve this is either through pulse width modulation or with beating detuned frequencies like respaces, which you then have to do a lot of processing to like get right. In this case, I only did one step of processing, which was putting the filter on. But like I showed in the other video about synthesis, you didn't even need that because that wavetable was constructed exactly for the purpose of that wide bass illusion kind of sound, which is really great when you want to add to certain patches. So yeah, I can't wait to actually get to the wavetable video because there is a lot I'd like to share, and really I don't know how I'm going to put it all into a linear topic. It might have to be multiple videos just for the wavetables alone. But yeah, look forward to all of that. So anyway, before I move on, let me play both wavetables hard panned so you can see exactly what's going on there. So you get a nice stereo image, but it is related. Also, of course, you can change the range if you don't want to include that extra part at the end, and then you can get something like this. Also, the amplitudes are very slightly different too. So I guess it would take work if you wanted it to be exactly perfect, but that's kind of the point, is for it to be not the same, so that way you have a stereo image. Otherwise, just use one oscillator, and if you're trying to achieve width or whatever, you can use detune, unison, or something like that. But anyway, let's demonstrate the patches that I've made using these wavetables. So this first one is called Modern Softy. I'm not really the best at naming it, but I figured it has the modern VCOs, and then on top of that it was a sort of soft patch, like a keys type patch, and here's what it sounds like. And it also has obviously some ways to change the timbre within the synth, because I want my sounds to be user-friendly and whatnot. So even if you don't want to deep dive into synthesis and you just want to use this patch to add to your collection, it should be ready to go. And I might even include a Ableton, like this whole thing, the Ableton group, and then obviously it's mapped to my keyboard here. So the first macro here is you can shift the timbre. And I wanted to show something really quick. If you see here, kind of like I was talking about in the other synthesis video, where this harmonic right here is happening in this frame of time, it kind of looks similar to what's happening over here. In this case, it's not perfectly in tune. It's not going to line up exact, but it's more or less going to be a frequency related to this added frequency on the left VCO that's being synced. And then on the right VCO, you have a dominance of the fundamental frequency because of this PWM offset. So really, with both of these tables working together, you kind of get the best of both worlds in a stereo image. You get the higher harmonics being accentuated in the first oscillator and the fundamental harmonic being accentuated in the second oscillator. So if I turn the sound back up, so yeah, you get kind of a stereo and spectral kind of blending. That one's not really one of my favorites though. The next macro is a pinch macro, which will essentially do a pseudo high pass filter or formant or something like that, where it will pinch the waveform together and take out the lower harmonic energy of the waveforms. If we take off the pinch, we also can remove low energy by taking the sub oscillator out, so that one's pretty straightforward. And now for my favorite effect, which is to take this very modern sounding synth that sounds kind of soft and key-ish, and then turn it into a nice crusty lo-fi, which is also what I consider somewhat soft, because it's not like really blowing out your ears distortion. There is a lot of distortion, but it's happening in a very lo-fi soft kind of way. So I have that special one mapped to a performance control that most people have access to, which is the mod wheel. So now notice the waveform is thin, it's degraded, it isn't as coherent. And if we turn the effects on and off, the effects is happening before the lo-fi effect chain. So essentially you can get that delay and reverb in a dry lo-fi fashion or in a modern, fully expanded fashion. It's really up to you. Or also, you'll notice the level change is pretty extreme there, but the thing is the lo-fi sound is a lot more distorted and compressed, so really I wanted to consider how it would work in a mix. So I'm hoping that in this case, the way I've balanced it, if you were, say, just automating this function in your song while performing, that you wouldn't actually have to do much, because it's trading off amplitude energy for spectral energy in the distortion. But if I did get that wrong, I guess all you really have to do is just turn that part up anyway, so it shouldn't be too much of a problem. Or if you want just a quick tip, if you don't know how you would do that, it should be pretty straightforward. You just use your mod matrix here, and then you would assign your mod wheel to any unit that has volume. So if we look in the effects chain here, this might be another slept on feature actually, now that I think about it. I don't know how many times I see people mention this in videos, but essentially all of these units where they have the mix knob here, if you click the mix knob, it changes into a gain knob. I don't know if you knew that. You can actually gain stage through all of these effects. So if you really know what you're doing with effects, like for example overdriving your distortion or overdriving your phaser or flanger if you wanted, you've had that option this whole time basically. But yeah, so click that again. I'm not really gonna add that feature now, but so you know, that's how you would do it. You would just map your mod wheel. You can even click here on the mod wheel and just drag it. You know what, maybe I will do it just for demonstration on camera. So click the mix on your last unit here, or if you want it to drive into something, like if you wanted it to drive into the flanger, I guess you could do it from the phaser here. But yeah, just drag the mod wheel over, hit Alt Shift, so that way it's unipolar, and then drag this down to your desired level. So this would be more something like perceived loudness right here. Although, keep in mind, this might unbalance some of the effects that I was going for, which is why I would instead recommend to just raise the level in post. If you use this automation and then bounce it to audio, just take the lo-fi part and raise its volume. Because if you look here, watch, let me take off the modulation here. If you notice, when I sweep the mod wheel, the way that it's balanced with its levels, when I am in the middle of the 2 points between the modern VCO that is fully capturing the whole spectrum and stereo field and whatever, and then the lo-fi part, which is kind of like a warbly pitch drifting and compressed, more mono and like flat. Essentially, it's like all of that energy is being crunched in the middle, and when you crossfade in between them, you're gonna get the full range stuff and the warbly stuff kind of cascading against each other and getting its own type of flanging happening. So this is like another flavor of lo-fi all on its own, just having it halfway. Anyway, so that is actually my first patch of 2025, and I'm pretty happy about that because it didn't turn out too bad. In the past, there's been a lot of patches. Like if I look here, you'll see I have years of these temporary files that I have to still comb through these and pull them all up to a standard. And a lot of them, as you can see, are work in progress. So really, either I was stuck on something I knew I would know later and be able to quickly fix it, or I was just straight up lazy and didn't feel like finishing the patch because I've been hearing it for too long, for probably hours. And you know, when you spend hours tweaking the sound, you kind of get a deafness to it, like an ear fatigue. And so it's really good to just kind of put it down and come back to it later. And then also I've even noticed the quality shift over the years. So like notice here in 2018, I have like a large amount, but only like 5 of these are probably gonna make the cut. And yet up here in 2023, I only have these, but they're all probably usable. And that's kind of how my journey has gone over the years of making patches and whatnot. But I am happy that the first patch of 2025 has been pretty decent. So I think this would be usable, and I'll make it available for download in the description. So anyway, let's take a look now at the second patch of 2025. I actually like this one better than the first one, which is a good sign. It's just still getting better. I hope anyway, that's kind of the goal. I was going for something actually softer than the last one, because the last one, although it was like soft, it wasn't like abrasive. It was like kind of in your face with all of that stereo and whatnot happening. So I wanted to make an even more lo-fi suitable one with this patch, which has a similar effect here. You'll see the first macro, it says lo-fi. I didn't macro that to the mod wheel in this case. The mod wheel for this instrument will have a different effect, which is kind of good. I want people that don't know how to use the interface of the synthesizer and really they're just kind of going through presets. I want them to have a large variety, which is something I changed before in my patches in the past. I would essentially map the cutoff frequency for a low pass filter to my mod wheel in most of the patches because I thought it was good to have a consistency. But since then I've actually changed my mind. I think maybe that would be more suitable for someone who doesn't want unpredictability and who wants to patch their own synth. But really, if that's the case, they're going to patch their own synth anyway. So that's pretty much why I changed my mind, and now I'm going to make them a lot more variety. Anyway, you'll notice this one is a lot simpler. Another thing I had to learn in making patches at some point was, before I used to make the mistake a lot of people do where they fill up every single effect and they macro each envelope and LFO to like 50 things, and they have so much motion in the patch that it actually starts at some point to have the opposite effect of benefit, where instead now it's just not as coherent of a sound. It's just really kind of a lot of spectral noise and whatnot. But in this case, the patch is so simple. We just have these soft waves with very subtle little nuances in the waveforms. Like on this waveform here, I have this little bump, which is going to add a little bit of even harmonics. And then on this wavetable, as I play, the edges of the waveform here and here will have a small snippet of silence that is being spectrally automated through time. So essentially that's going to sound like this. That was a terrible phrase, but whatever. So with this patch, I like this one a lot better because I designed it to have the use of velocity, which is something that is missing in a lot of my patches. That's just because personally when I make tracks and whatnot, I like to use MIDI that basically has no velocity programmed in it, and then I use like other instruments to program the velocity in, like arpeggiators or Cthulhu. And then secondly, I'm also not a performer, obviously, so you know, it's not really been a priority of mine. But now that I'm thinking about it more seriously in the idea of making it available for other people, I want it to be available to everyone, whether they're a synth patcher, a performer, or just dragging something in their DAW and trying to get a good sound. So yeah, in this case, this one will be more focused for performance because the velocity that you play, you'll notice if I hit a key very soft, the waveform animation I've programmed in won't be as triggered. You'll get more of a sine wave shape. You know what? I was playing the wrong instrument this whole time. I thought it sounded weird. Okay, so here we go. Here's the correct instrument. So that's me playing it very soft. Notice the waveforms, you can see how they are more sine wave shaped, which is basically kind of like the same thing as low pass filtering. Since the skewing of these waveforms has been reduced down to sine waves, you will have lesser upper harmonics. And if you ever look at a waveform when you're low passing, that's kind of what you see too, right? If you imagine like a saw wave and then you low pass it, it starts to get that kind of round part. That's essentially just low frequency information without all of the upper information of those, what I call transfer curves. But honestly, I don't know what the correct term for that phenomenon is in a waveform, but essentially it's just like when you have a spike and then you have like DC offset, which is this way, and then everything in between is like curvature of how energy is responding. And so like square waves would be usually like rounding until they're actually squared off. They will flatten out and take large amounts of energy in your waveform, where like saw waves can be like a saw, like you could imagine, and then as you thin them out, like a high pass filter effect, you get less and less energy information happening away from the 0 point, but it stays within the kind of idea of a saw. That's why if you've ever used a compressor or a distortion on a saw and you push the volume through it and it starts rounding off the edges of the saw, it starts to sound more and more like a square because you're literally pushing it into the shape of a square in that way, which is a amplitude and spectrum way. But anyway, that was too much of a deep dive. Let's just look at the patch. So with this patch, as you play harder, it will maintain the more saw-like shape that it has now, which is still soft enough not to be a saw and have that abrasive brightness to it, but it is also harmonic enough that your ears will pick up a more present tonality to it. Actually, let me see if I can find something peaceful really quick. I'll just cut it in the editing. So anyway, yeah, I was trying to play a little bit of a variety in my velocity there. I wasn't looking at the screen, but hopefully it showed that there was a difference in the waveforms. So essentially, I'm not only changing volume, which is a typical use case of assigning velocity in Serum as an automation, but I was also increasing a timbral presence by adding harmonics. So soft notes, like I said already, will be sine waves, and harder notes will be more skewed towards harmonics. There's also a lot of other features that I've considered advanced discoveries of making patches over the years. I noticed that when you use a comb filter like this in a additive kind of sense that isn't too resonant, you kind of force harmonics that are being fed into the filter to conform to a certain harmonic relationship. And so I can't really explain that. I might do a more advanced look at that in a future video. But say I had the comb filter in this position and then I was using a very fast pulse width modulated square wave and it was creating that ugly buzz buzzing detuning sound that I showed in the other video. The comb filter would help to conform that back into a more coherent, stable pitch. But also the downside is the comb filter itself can cause pitch destabilization because of the nature of how it's working. And that's especially noticeable if you change the cutoff or ever tried to automate the cutoff of it with a LFO or something. You'll notice how it starts to then detune just like the pulse width does in a ugly way. At least I consider it ugly. Of course, everything is a matter of opinion, so just like cooking, just like food, really it's just what have you become acquainted with and what sounds do you like. And for me, I just don't like the sound of spectral information just being smeared and not being coherent. But that could just be me. Anyway, this synth also has a lo-fi macro here. And wow, listen to that. I think I pretty much nailed the lo-fi in this case, all within Serum, so no external effects needed. I managed to actually get the wow and flutter effect from this all-pass filter, which is awesome because I was using what I was explaining a moment ago as a, what is that called? I'm trying to think of what word to use. Not as a flaw, but essentially like a negative aspect, right? So what I was talking about with this comb filter, how it can be detuned sounding when you change the cutoff, that's the exact phenomenon in this all-pass filter that I'm using on purpose. So to get that wow and flutter detuning for lo-fi, I just use the all-pass filter to achieve that. And really, if you were clever enough, you can achieve that with a lot of these effects, including chorus, phaser, flanger, hyperdimension. Any of those effects that can have effect on your source's pitch can be automated to then abuse that in a beneficial way when you use Chaos, which is over here. I don't know if you ever use it, but Chaos 1 and Chaos 2 are in the global tab, and essentially they're just noise oscillators, which can be extremely useful. So anyway, with the lo-fi enabled, that's the lo-fi. And then just like the previous one, when you have it halfway, the pitch destabilization of the wow and flutter will then be crossfaded with the coherence of the non-lo-fi side, essentially, of the macro. And because of that, now you have a duplicate of the sound, and the pitch destabilization is going to flange and cascade against the coherent one, basically giving you like a chorus effect. By the way, I want to apologize if there's any points in this video that I can't cut out the squeakiness of my chair. I'm just going to go ahead and give it the spotlight for a second, but look how bad this chair is. So that's my life. I have to deal with that. Anyway, the other control here, as you can see, it's only macroed to one place, so it's pretty straightforward. It's just the decay envelope. But like I said, there's a lot of people who aren't synth deep divers who will use this patch and say they, in their mind, wanted to change the decay of the sound. They just didn't know that was the word assigned to it. Kind of like I was talking about in my last video about music theory. Like, I know how I hear the chords in my mind. I just don't necessarily have the knowledge of the words assigned to those chords, so I can't really just go straight to it. I have to like finagle it in the software until it's right, or I can try using the keys or something like that. Basically the same concept for synthesis. If someone is trying to use this instrument in their track and they don't know how to deep dive and program a synthesizer, but yet they are familiar with the fact that Serum has these 4 macros on the side, then they'll probably just tweak those as an extra few seconds between going through the presets to see if it's going to get them any closer to the sound they want. And then if it does or doesn't, that'll determine if they go to the next patch. So in this case, if they wanted to lower the decay, if they didn't want the sound to go for that long, they might actually attempt using the macro and be like, oh wait, that's exactly what I needed. Now I could fit it in this transition or whatever. It depends obviously on their compositional use case. But yeah, that is the second control on this synth. Again, my playing not so great. But yeah, and then kind of like with the little bit I said earlier about holding back and not filling all of these effects, not filling all of these macros, I kind of kept it simple. But if you wanted some variation, the mod wheel in this case is going to turn the key archetype of the sound more into a long pad archetype. So essentially you get kind of two patches in one. Let me play a chord that's not so scary. So yeah, you can see how now it's like a pad essentially. The attack has been increased, and so now instead of it just hitting, it will like slowly fade in, and it'll also slowly fade out. But keep in mind, the decay is macroed, so you can get sort of a attack with no decay type of pad. Of course, remember there's also the lo-fi. This is probably going to be weird because I'm cutting this down, so it's going to sound like I'm just going right back to something I just said. But I just wanted to cover all of the variety of sound of this just one patch. That sounded nice. That was a total accident. I don't know what I did, but that sounded nice, right? Anyway, so that's the second patch. I could pretty much call that the end of the video, but I would like to make one patch on screen, and maybe that will give me an excuse to do a little bit of synthesis deep diving while I do that. And so, of course, all three of them will be available for download with the option of donation, or I guess tip is what they call it. So anyway, let's open a brand new Serum. And first thing is kind of like I demonstrated in my last video about making MIDIs or whatever, that moment where I had to kind of just sit in silence in the blank canvas and wait for the sound to come to me. That's kind of the same thing when making a synth patch. So sure, I could quickly just decide I'm gonna make a bass patch or I'm gonna make a pad patch, but really even that is not enough context for me, because then I'll end up making a patch that is disappointing to myself because it has nothing to do with anything I heard or whatever. Because remember, kind of like I said earlier, how sound is really a matter of taste. Your taste can also be temporal and change depending on the moment or what mood you're in. So there's sometimes I have a taste for heavy metal and I just want to listen to a lot of distortion and stuff. And then other times I just want to relax and listen to lo-fi. So it's kind of the same thing. If I'm in the mood for something, but I'm not quite sure what it is, and then I make a patch with a rigid idea, a plan I made of just like making a bass patch or something like that, sometimes I'll either make a low quality patch that is just not aligning with anything I was feeling, or it'll just be straight up disappointing, and that feeling alone will cause me to make a bad sounding patch because the sound of my disappointment will start to reflect in my patch. So anyway, same concept here is I'm going to sit in the silence and kind of try and decide what I want to make. I got it. Okay, so I'm going to make a sign pluck patch. If you don't already know what that is, it's basically, I think a guy that was using it was Son Holo. Essentially, it's like a very percussive kind of patch that's very soft because there's not a lot of upper harmonics happening because it's from a sine wave. But what's funny is if you change those conditions just a little bit, then you get like an 808 bass. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my wavetables here, my many wavetables, and I'm going to pick a sine. But the thing is, my wavetables are all multi-purpose, so it's not like I'm just selecting a sine wave. If I wanted that, all I'd have to do is go in here, hit clear all, and then pull up the first harmonic, and boom, you have a perfect sine wave. But that's not what we're going to do. I'm going to go into my wavetables here and then look for a sine wave. So in digital CU here, I have many versions of sine. So you'll see all these start with sine, and then same goes for saw, square, triangle. Here's some of those tone mods that I was mentioning. And this is just the digital CU list. There's all of these lists as well. So really, depending on the use case of your synthesis, knowing what these wavetables do and where they are most useful will make patching feel very immediate and maybe even rewarding. Because kind of like in the other video about music theory and making MIDIs, how I felt pretty proud of myself when I accidentally guessed the scale of harmonic minor. That's kind of how it feels when you're making a synth patch and you kind of just go straight to it with the most minimal finagling possible. It's a very good feeling. But anyway, so I am gonna finagle in this case because I don't know exactly which sine wave I want to use. So I'm just gonna look through them a little bit. So kind of think of this as a mini sneak peek into my wavetable video that I'm gonna do, but we're just looking at sine waves for now. So this one right here is basically a formula. The title is all kind of weird, but it's a formula I got offline. No, I didn't make this wavetable myself, but that's okay because this wavetable is like an essential. I don't know if you've heard of wave folders in synthesizers or wave folding in general, but it's essentially a tool as universal as a filter. So I just added something that, in my opinion, Serum should have had built into it anyway. Here in the warp modes, there should have been down here like a wave folder. But yeah, in this case, I just had to go online, and then this simple formula that I typed gave me a perfect wave folder. And if you don't know what that sounds like, it's basically a West Coast synthesis approach. So say for example, East Coast, where you have a waveform and then you use a low pass filter to round it off. It's kind of the opposite of that. You start with a sine wave that's rounded off already, and then you add harmonics by folding the waveform back in on itself. That's wave folding. And then let's see what else. I won't play the sound. I will sweep these so I can make my decision. So you can see the variety of my wavetables. And this is, like I said, just the sine wavetables. Okay, so I think I'm going to go with the sine clipper table. Essentially, it starts from silence, kind of like the wavefolder one that I just showed, and then it clips into the ceiling and turns into more or less a square wave. Which kind of sounds like an analog vintage synth. You know, a lot of the square waves back then had a type of slew between the change of value, like this value up here and this value down here. Essentially, it wouldn't look like this. It would be like this shape going down and then this shape going up. But that is such a minimal difference that it's not going to be that audibly different than what we're hearing anyway. So yeah, if you want that analog sound, as everyone keeps saying, this is a good way to get that. It kind of reminds me of my Moog Prodigy. But anyway, I'm going to use this in my sine pluck patch because the sine pluck patch calls for just a plain sine wave. I wasn't really needing to look for anything special anyway. But if I wanted to add some odd harmonics, all I got to do is push this into the ceiling a little bit. So how to make a sine pluck. First thing you need to do is get a sine, then you get an LFO or an envelope, and then you pluck it. I don't like using my envelope windows here. I don't know why. That could just be like a phobia or something, but I'm going to use my LFO in envelope mode, and that really should achieve the same thing anyway. Also, if you're ever going to do that, make sure you turn everything off. So you don't want BPM or any of that active. You want the hertz right here to be an exact time regardless of the BPM of someone's song. Because say for example, you made a really fast pluck, but they were in a very slow BPM, well now your pluck is going to not be fast, which will change how you used it in your patch. So anyway, first step is to send this up to the coarse pitch, go into the mod matrix, change it to unipolar, or if you don't want to go to the mod matrix, you can hover over the automation symbol here and hit Shift Alt, and that will switch between unipolar and bipolar. By the way, let me change the skin so that way it's more familiar for everyone. You'll see it switches it, even if you extend it or whatever, change the value, it will switch between polar and unipolar, and that goes for everything. If you send it here, same thing, unipolar, bipolar, whatever. So what we want is unipolar on the coarse pitch, and we want to make this pluck happen very fast. Now you notice we got that chirping sound, and that is going to be one of the main distinctions of this type of patch. So now we want to shape the envelope of the sound to have some decay. So I'm going to increase the decay here, and then I'm also going to take the sustain down so that way the decay has point. So now when I hit a note, it will slowly decay. But also I want it to decay when I hit a note and let go, which it's not doing. So we're going to add release. So basically, as it's falling down the decay, if you let go, it will just jump to silence. But when you turn up the release, as it's falling to this point, it will then jump to the release point and then decay from there. Notice that gives you a variety in the way you're playing that is similar to velocity, but this has nothing to do with velocity at all. It has to do with the amount of time that the gate is open, which basically means how long is the key down. Now, we could consider velocity in this patch, so let's use that actually. I'm going to assign the velocity to the release, because that will then determine the amount of time the sound is being perceived. And so softer velocities, I want to be quick, so let's play it as soft as we can and get it at the most minimal value that we want to happen. I want it a little longer than that. Somewhere like there. And then generally the hardest point would be pretty extreme, so we're going to turn that up and then go down from there. Right. Now that's pretty extreme, and I only want that to happen sometimes when people are really slamming the keyboard. So I'm now going to go into the mod matrix here and then use this modulation curve. And essentially what that means is, instead of the velocity curve here being linear, it will respond with this curve, which is the same exact thing as just changing the curve here, but I don't want to change the curve here in case I'm going to assign this to something else where I don't want that type of response, right? So it's handy that in the modulation matrix, each modulation gets its own curve like that. Correction, I want the curve to be like this. So now when you are playing the keys at all of these ranges, it will be essentially just a little bit lower and not at the longest release time that has been set by the maximum of the modulation. Yeah, I'm going to relax that just a little bit, maybe just like something like that, just enough to give it a more dynamic range as someone's playing. All right, so now what is the next step? Let's see. I want the sine wave to change its timbre just a little bit. So actually, I've changed my mind on which sine wave table I'm going to use. I'm going to go to a pinch table, which is what I'm calling them nowadays. Before I used to call these PWM because of that phenomenon of width when you're automating them. The thing is, that's not the only phenomenon happening when you use this table right here. Yes, you are getting that width thing happening from these, I was about to point to the screen, from these points right here when they are moving towards and away from each other. Yes, you will get that width kind of sound, but also the other phenomenon happening in this wavetable is that if you look here, the amount of energy away from the 0 point is disappearing. And so you're going to get less of the lower energy and more of the higher energy, but yet all being still this pitch because it's happening in this waveframe, right? So essentially this is a similar effect to a high-pass filter. Also, another factor is the fact that the transfer curve is bending, so we're going to get various distortions as we change this wavetable. So actually, I might want to use this one instead, where we don't have that transfer curve distortion. You know what, I changed my mind again. Let me compare and be sure exactly which table I want to use here, because essentially I'm getting the same thing. From this table, these flat points that are appearing here are going to give me overtones and distortion to the sine wave because they're such different profiles. But in this case, I'll be getting distortion and harmonics from this flat point appearing here, which is the same thing when I use the sine clipper here and I get the flat points up here and down here. So it's really kind of a matter of flavor, and so I'm going to demo them really quick and make a decision. feel like this one's a little brighter, so I actually am gonna go with the original choice of the sine clipper. So I want to add harmonics, but in the softest way possible. Another way I can do that is to simply use a warp mode. So if you don't want to make fancy wavetables like I have, you can just use a sine wave like this and then bend it. And this will give you a nice amount of even overtones versus odd overtones. And yeah, that's basically how waveforms work. Like I was trying to say in my video about synthesis, and what I hope to in future videos do more of a deep dive in, is the concept of using waveforms as your basis of thought, I guess. Instead of thinking about using processors like distortion and exciters and EQs and whatever, if you know how waveforms behave, you can essentially at the waveform level achieve a lot of those effects and never need to use those processors, which can add a lot of phase incoherences and delays and whatnot, depending on how good the plugins are, I guess, and how they work. Some are based off time, some are based off phase, you know. There's a lot to it that makes these subtle differences. If you were to actually just process simple waveforms, like basic synth waveforms, like saw, square, sine, triangle, through various effects, and then observe what those effects are doing to it visually, that would actually give a pretty good insight as well into the result you're hearing and what it looks like. And so in the deep diving, I'm going to talk a lot about how certain, like for a quick example, symmetry in two different axes will give you different levels of that squarified sound, and then obviously things that are asymmetrical will give you even harmonics and that asymmetrical buzzy or nasally kind of sound. And then I guess we already covered sort of the topic of mathematically related information in the waveform, which is like overtone frequencies and whatnot. And then there's a lot more to that. There's the different properties of certain noises, because there are a lot of different types of noise, and I don't mean just like pink noise, white noise, red noise, but like there's just other types of noise that are really something I can't put into words. I'll just have to cover that in the future. And so depending on a certain flavor, I've actually found a lot of those noises useful in my recent lo-fi journey I've been taking, because I've been learning how to make lo-fi sounds for sample packs and synth patches. And it's really tricky because you have to have this fine balance of distortion and ugliness, but without that brittle harshness. So you need like warm noise, if I was to try to put that into words. So anyway, long tangent, let's get back to the patch here. Okay, now that I'm hearing it, I do want a little bit of even harmonics, so I'm going to skew it with the bend mode just a little bit. Actually, I'm going to try the asymmetrical mode for a second. Yeah, I think I prefer this asymmetrical mode. So this is achieving the same thing by adding overtones, but in this case, it's doing it in a way that is a little bit more asymmetrical, which is going to introduce more even harmonics, but you also get this kind of kink here, which is going to add a little more sharpness and brightness. And then on top of that, another thing that's happening is pretty much what you're seeing with your eyes. There's two different frequencies happening here. And so I'll do a more deep dive later on to the significance of that. Within that one waveframe, you're having two wave events happening, which is a terminology I made up. I'm not sure what to call it, but I think wave events fits pretty well to describe an event happening within a wave cycle that is related to itself. And that will become extremely important later on when I'm explaining drones and using multiple frequencies summed into one wave. Kind of like how I mentioned about things moving together and things not moving together. The things that are moving together, if you have 6 frequencies in one summed waveform and they're locked together per frequency, your mind is going to actually identify through all of that noisy information those 6 events that are related to each other. And basically that's what's happening here in this one wave cycle, is we have these 2 events that are related to each other each time it's cycling. Anyway, we're doing it for just the harmonic benefit, so keep that in mind, that synthesis isn't exactly linear where I want X so I add X. It's more like all of these approaches can yield many results, and you have to kind of balance them with all these components that will also have their batch of results, and then from all of that get the thing you want, which is like lemons, limes, and oranges, right? They're all acidic, but yet they have attributes that will yield one better for a drink, one better for tacos, you know, if you like that kind of thing. But anyway, let's go back to the synthesis. So I want the harmonics to happen slightly after the transient. So I'm going to go ahead and hold Alt and move LFO1 over to LFO2. That just makes a copy. If you don't believe me, look here at LFO3, that's still default. And now I'll drag it again over and boom. Don't know if you knew that feature, but you know it now. So anyway, I'm going to take this waveform, and essentially this is the transient of the pluck. I want the opposite to happen, where slightly after that pluck, I'll actually put the node here and then increase this point. We'll slowly introduce the asymmetry here, very subtly. You know what, actually, I'm gonna make this much longer, and I'm just gonna find where the transient ends. So now if I have it down here, I can turn this up to taste and find the point where the harmonics added is at a desirable level. So notice how that is a lot different if I were to go in the mod matrix here and just bypass that. So go to the mod tab right here and then hit bypass. Versus it has more of like a, it's hard to describe, maybe like a toy keyboard kind of sound, or just like a bell chimey metal-y kind of sound. And really that's not due to its overtones at all. I think that's more of like an illusion because of the other factors happening. Because really if you focus on the timbres, it still sounds extremely synthetic. But if we wanted it to sound more organic, we could do that. That's not what I was gonna go for, but actually I'm curious, so let's go for it. So I'm going to do the same trick I did in the other patch about the comb filter to demonstrate that effect. So if I go to comb positive, because I want the boosts to be in the harmonic ratios additively and not subtractively, and then bring the drive up to 0. So basically this isn't doing much here. Increase the resonance. And now for the tricky part, I have to find where the filter would be perfectly tuned to the oscillator. So to help do that, I'm actually going to grab a random noisy oscillator. So from the earliest wavetables I ever made back in the beginning of like the Serum days, I made these wavetables here, which are all a bunch of kind of unrelated noise per cycle. Don't get me wrong though, they are cool. Like if I open another instance of Serum here just to demonstrate, it's one wavetable called Emerald. It definitely has a distinctive sound. So look when I sweep it. I don't know what that is. I've been actually chasing for a while the exact phenomena happening in this wavetable to create that effect. And so far my only hunch is that it has something to do with delay. And I don't mean delay like in time, but I guess I mean like the repetitions of waves decaying being baked into a waveform. But I'm trying to figure out exactly why and how that happened. Or maybe it really is just that simple and our brain can detect a baked in delay. I don't know. Maybe I'll figure that out someday. So I'm going to use a less coherent patch like maybe this one right here. And the sole purpose of it is to find the pitch of the comb filter. First, I'm going to remind myself of the pitch of the other oscillator. It might be there. Yeah, like right about there. So now I'm gonna remove this because I don't need it. Let's just go to add remove here and then hit init all, and now we get the saw wave that it defaults with. So now if I reduce the resonance to be just so slight and then crank the drive up to the zero line. Now the bumps are accentuating the harmonic series. So everything happening before that, including the glissando of that pluck, which even though it's happening in a very small amount of time, it is a pitch that is sweeping through. And when it's hitting the comb filter, the points where it's in the harmonic series of the filter will be louder than the points where the filter is lower. So all of these little notches here, that sweep is going to convolute to this filter with the added artifact of a small delay. So you'll also get kind of a small like slapback delay kind of thing. Very subtle, but let's hear without. Very synthetic. See how now it sounds more like organic, I would say, like a nylon string or something like that. So again, without, very synthetic, very perfect. And then with. Actually, if you want to be really nitpicky and talk about how it just sounds different because it's louder, I can also click the mix here, just like I said in the effects section. Not sure if you knew this was a feature or not, but now you know. You just click here where it says mix, and now it is a level control, and we can gain stage to compensate for the boost added by that. Looks like it actually lowered the level a lot, even though the level's at its maximum, so I'm gonna just drive it into it instead, which is gonna add a little saturation, but I guess I've run into a wall of Serum's capability in this case since the level is actually already maxed. So yeah, now it has a more organic kind of asymmetrical kind of sound. And then let's see, what else can we add to this? I'm actually going to create a second glissando since this pluck is happening super fast, giving us that chirpiness. I'm just curious what would happen if I created another glissando that was just a little bit slower. So same thing, I'm going to send this to the coarse pitch because I don't want the stepped changes in pitch that you get with semitones or anything like that. I want it to just be coarse, like a straight D tune. And then I'm going to use Shift and Alt to make sure that this is unipolar. And then I'm going to reduce the range of it a little bit and increase the time of the LFO, or envelope in this case. Now, something I'm not liking about the patch is how it's sounding in the lower area here. So it looks like I'm going to have to use some type of note automation, and this might be where the sine clipper comes into play. So as the notes go lower, I want to increase the value, so I'm going to switch that around like that. And then the lower the notes go, I want this to clip into the ceiling a little bit. And also I want to extend the range of the asymmetry on the warp mode. I want to make sure the majority of the notes are unaffected, so I'm going to create a node here and do something like this. Maybe even another node here, because I don't think this is a patch that would be going much lower than this note. Let's just see the lower octave. Cool, so we're back into like organic territory now. Okay, so we have quite a bit of sound happening here, and we haven't even opened the second oscillator. I don't think I'm going to need to though, because in this case, unless I want to subtract from the first oscillator, you know what, maybe we could. Let me see if I have a wavetable really quick that is in phase of the sine wave. That could be a nice subtraction element. Ooh, you know what? I made a whole list of these chirp impulses, and I haven't actually used them yet. The thing is, these are unipolar, so this isn't actually only going to subtract from the sine wave, it's going to add to it. But let's just see what happens really quick. I'm curious. So I'm gonna want to turn down the phase and random now, since I want these to be related. Really, I should have had that the whole time anyway, so that way the sine wave would always start at the same point. I want the sine wave to kind of start at a high energy point, so it has that initial click on top of the glissando click that we're getting from the chirp. So I'm going to increase the phase to its highest point here, and then now, since the phase on this waveform is also going up starting at the exact position, we'll have the most constructive interference possible for the initial transient, which is going to add to the dynamics of the sound. So here's without, and here's with. And then this is a wavetable, it's not just a waveform, so I actually can automate this. So I kind of like the way it sounds when it is subtracting during the decay stage. So I'm going to create another copy with Alt and then drag to LFO4 and then increase the time of this even longer and then send that to my wavetable to move this direction. So this is going to be the very tail end of the sound. The upper harmonics are going to animate just a little bit. Which will be more apparent if I drop the octave. Hey, that's a cool sound, but that's not what I'm going for, so we're not going to use that. That is a cool sound though. No, we're not going to use that. Let's go back to normal. So this goes back to what I said earlier, how when you're playing with a patch for so long, you kind of get ear fatigue, or you just get used to it, and then you kind of lose inspiration to move forward with it. So this would be a good point to put it down and come back to it later. But I do want to finish it in this run so I can make all three available for download. So let's move on to the effects section and start doing the normal bits and bobs. I'm not going to be as explanatory for this segment. I'm just going to kind of finagle and then get it to like a place that I could consider decent. Okay, so this seems okay, I guess. Basically, the phaser is just frozen in place. The LFO rate is at 0, so it's not really doing the phasing necessarily. It's just like in EQ, shaping the sound a certain way. And then the distortion is just ever so slightly adding a little bit more harmonics, except for the transient, which I have automated by the medium speed envelope here. And then the reverb, which is self-explanatory. And now I'm going to add a copy of what I did in my last patch that I was pretty happy with, which is just that lo-fi effect. So I'm going to open a filter here and find in miscellaneous the all pass filter, and then I'm going to turn that off for a second because also I want EQ to turn down the high frequencies. So I'm going to use my mod wheel in this case and turn down the high frequencies with either a high shelf or a low pass. So let's go ahead and use Alt Shift, make that unipolar, drag it down, turn up my mod wheel so it can have effect and see how it sounds with the shelf. I think I will go with the shelf because I'm going to assume if I switch this now to a low pass instead, that the brightness of the initial transient will be lost. So like if I remove now the modulation there, turn the Q to flat, and then make the mod wheel now just turn down the frequency of the low pass. You can still detect the transient, but it's really just kind of been washed away, and so it kind of defeats the purpose of it. And a lot of work went into the transient alone, since the whole patch is basically a transient. So yeah, let's remove the modulator on there. I'm going to hold Control and click these to get back to their default positions. Don't know if you knew that, but now you do. And then switch this back into shelf mode. Take my mod wheel to the gain, Shift Alt unipolar, and then take the value down. So here's without. So we've significantly tamed the brightness of it. Also, to make it have lo-fi, we're going to remove the bass frequencies as well. So we're going to reduce the range of it overall, and your mind is going to detect that when you, especially during a transition, that you've lost information. So we're going to switch this to high pass, take down the Q so that way it's flat. Put the cutoff frequency at normal position so that way it will be open. But then when the mod wheel is high at its max value, we'll put the mod envelope, we'll assign that to the frequency and then find a good spot for it. So I want it there, where essentially it's around the second and third harmonic, and we've cut out the fundamental frequency completely, but we're still gonna hear that main frequency because of the phantom bass effect from all of its overtones being mathematically related to what once was the fundamental frequency. So although we've removed it, really it's just a color shift more than it is a changing of any kind of frequency. But really that's an over explanation of a high pass filter. I'm sure you know what a high pass filter sounds like. Okay, I think also for lo-fi, I would take away the width of the reverb here. So that way, again, there's less information happening in comparison without the lo-fi macro up, or in this case, the mod wheel. So here's the original. Actually, it kind of just sounds quieter, so I think I'm going to distort it a little bit too. So let's add a little bit of drive and mix to the mod wheel here. Actually, I think I like it better with less mix because it's not as present with the way the harmonics are coming off. Okay, and to really bring in that lo-fi, we're gonna bring in that filter back, and then I'm going to change the cutoff here and find a spot that is very resonant to the main frequencies coming out of the patch. Which seems about right here. And then to assign the chaos to it, or the noise oscillator that's hidden away in this global tab here, we can just right click it and then mod source and chaos 1. And so in this case, we can't drag the modulation little wheel that usually appears here in blue. So we have to go to the mod matrix now, scroll down, and then introduce the amount we want from here. And I do want it to be bipolar, so I'm gonna click this and then introduce the value here. Now I'm also going to add another chaos element at a slower rate. So since we're in the matrix here, we can actually just do it from here. I can go here and select chaos 2 as my modulator, and then send the destination to the effects and then to the filter frequency. Now with this one, I want to make sure the rate is very slow because this is going to be the wow and the chaos 1 is going to be the flutter. Also, I want to make sure these are mono because I don't want any polyphony happening if people do decide to use chords for this patch, which I wouldn't recommend. I would actually prefer to make this patch mono by clicking this here. And now the patch is forced to a mono synthesizer, but I will leave that off in case people do like this sound for chords. But it is important in that case that I make sure the chaos modulators are mono. That way there isn't different chaos happening per note, which would lead to too much incoherence and thus giving the sound a more modern kind of wideness to it. Instead, it will stay coherent, but also lo-fi for the simple fact that the pitch is very unstable. So for example, if I wanted to really demonstrate that, I can open a spectrogram and look at it. I have a tag that I've made, which is something I covered in a recent video. Even though it could be pretty inconvenient, I recommend taking the time to actually tag everything in a way that you would use it, and that way you have the fastest route to what you're looking for. So for me, I just use visualizer here, and then I can go to isotope, and now I have what I was wanting. We drag that in. I'm going to open that up. Since I'm so familiar with this spectrogram and the way it responds to audio, this will be the ideal choice for me to see the pitch variation for creating this wow and flutter effect. So I'm going to increase the range of the wow, which is chaos 2 here. Also, I noticed that it is actually a little bit too slow, so I'm going to increase that. There we go. That's what I was looking for. So if you can see in the matrix here how it is going a little bit too crazy actually, I'm going to reduce its value here. And this is going to simulate an unstable player on like a tape machine. I don't know how this works exactly. I'm not that familiar with tape machines, but the little spoke that spins the tape, when it kind of oscillates back and forth, that's what this is simulating. So to add to that, I'm actually going to add a LFO and then take the BPM off, make sure it's not triggered or anything like that. Take the anchor off, so it's just a pure LFO happening at this rate. And then I'm going to also add that to the filter frequency here. Go back to the matrix since we've been there nice and comfortable. I'm going to make sure it's bipolar by clicking here and then reduce that effect to basically 0 and then just increase it. Okay, so I made the chaos bipolar, I forgot to do that, and I've significantly decreased its value. So now we have a nice lo-fi effect from the inconsistency in the pitch. It's actually still a bit much. Let me go ahead and set it to just 1. So as you can see here, I have all of these set to literally just like 1, and then Chaos 2 is at -2, and they're all bipolar, so they're a fraction of 1. And now just that little subtle variation alone is going to give it this sound. Sort of lo-fi. Now if we turn down the mod wheel, we'll remember what the original patch looked like. You know what? I don't like that reverb, so I'm going to subtract that. I want the reverb to only be there when the lo-fi is there, because it did add a lot of nice kind of extra decay information, extension of the sound essentially happening that's being pushed through those lo-fi effects. So in this case, I'm going to send the modulation from the mod wheel to the mix of the reverb and kind of eyeball like where this point is. So from here, from 0 to the center, I want that to match on the other side. So I'm going to kind of just eyeball it, maybe like right there. And then when I turn it down, I want this blue point to be exactly where this white line on the knob is. So then we'll just take a little bit off there. And now we have our dry effect without the lo-fi engaged. Oh, and that's another thing I just realized. The pitch effects are still engaged, so that's kind of a big one right there. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure that these are only active when the modulation wheel is high. So in order to do that, we want our aux source to be the mod wheel. There, so now the modulation will happen when the mod wheel is high, with the pitch destabilization, but when the mod wheel is low, it's very still, and we get back to that toy piano chimey kind of thing. I could actually make this closer to a toy piano and start deviating from the sine pluck thing by introducing inharmonic overtones, which I could probably do with some type of FM, or maybe using the noise oscillator if I want to be a little cheaty about it, but I'm not going to go through that, so we'll just leave it how it is. Notice that in this mode, chords don't really sound so nice. But in the lo-fi mode, it's actually a lot more acceptable because of all of the smearing of the harmonics anyway. So when the lo-fi is not engaged, you can see even in the spectrogram here, how rigid and exact those pitches are looking. So when you have a chord, those extremely coherent overtones are gonna then clash whilst being coherent, and meaning you're gonna have a increased perception of all of that clashing, which is quite unpleasant, especially if it's bright and sharp and high pitched. But when you have the lo-fi up, those frequencies are smeared and already kind of clashing on a very microscopic scale, so it's a lot easier to deal with more clashing. Also, you know what? I don't think I like that initial plucky transient in the lo-fi mode, so it seems like the lo-fi side of this patch has really kind of won me over and taken priority. So I'm actually going to also assign this mod wheel in the matrix here to the LFO that is making that initial transient, which was the first modulation we assigned. So LFO 1 here going to coarse pitch. I'm going to add the mod wheel to that and then invert, so that way it's happening when the mod wheel is low instead of high. So with the mod wheel low, we have the original patch. And then with it high, that pluck won't be as prominent. Now, I do want the user to have a choice to have that pluck in there. So what I'm going to do is with this modulation curve over here on this side, which determines the amount of the mod wheel affecting that modulation range, I'm going to create a curve like this. So basically, as soon as I start turning down the modulation wheel just a little bit, we'll get a lot of that transient back. So you'll see here on Serum, this digital version of it, I've barely turned it down, and that pluck is pretty much fully returned. Which is fine, because then the more you go down, it'll still be at full range. Now you have this nice gradient of lo-fi to blend into your patch. This is pretty much a very organic way to make this patch feel like an instrument. So it's feeling pretty good as a patch. I think I'm going to call it for this one. Now notice that in this case, I still didn't fill every single effect. I didn't fill any of the modulation. Everything's just on the mod wheel. But this patch is specifically benefiting the feeling of an instrument by having the velocity and the note modulation, so that way lower octaves sound a little bit different than just the high part being lower, which is kind of like that sampler effect where it's like the same as you move up and down. In this case, it will organically start to shift its sound the lower you go. My point was, every patch is different if you start getting to this level of making patches where you don't have to have this invisible checklist in your mind that, oh, I have to make every single patch use every effect to its maximum. What I found was that in doing that, a lot of my patches became messy and unusable and unfocused. So in this case, it's actually kind of cool to let go of that and see how each patch will turn out different. And like in some cases like this one, there's no modulation macros whatsoever, but you can see my mod wheel here has 10 destinations. Really try and keep it simple and keep it to the point of what you were going for. I hope you found this video interesting and helpful and useful. If you have any questions, of course, leave that in the comments, because I love to share everything I know, and also that helps me to know exactly where people are at in general on their knowledge of synthesis, because for all I know, this might have all been a no-brainer to someone. At the same time, there could be a lot of people that didn't know anything they saw in this video. So leaving comments below will help me to kind of gauge where people stand in making these types of patches. And if I find that not a lot of people found this useful, then I'll shift my focus to other kinds of patches like drones or pads or plucks. Yeah, stay tuned for more. It's going to be really fun when we get into modular and modular synthesis, because the limitations of, say, Serum here, for example, completely vanish. And then the only limitation at that point is your imagination and ultimately your computer, if your CPU can handle it without exploding. But beyond that, it kind of goes into some pretty crazy territory that you can make everything from really intentional, focused, beautiful sounds to just straight up experimenting the frontier and not knowing a single thing you're doing, but yet coming out with amazing results. That's the joy of synthesis and exploring the sonic frontier, is that eventually you will discover information that is either simply pleasing to you and something that everyone kind of knows, or is something that no one's ever seen before, and now you have something you can share. The joy of modular synthesis can't really be expressed It's only something that few will experience. It's not for everyone, certainly, but for the people that are watching videos about synthesis, I would assume you're more likely to be one of those people. And then I also can't wait to get into actual analog modular, which is a whole different beast. And it's not the whole can of worms analog versus digital thing. There are elements of that, sure, because you know, you have sample rate on digital side, you have infinite resolution on electricity side, but those are just like scientific measurements. They're not exactly contributing to the overall soul of the sound. There's also the kinetic and physical variables to working with analog modular. For example, the limitation itself, the fact that you can't just drag in 50 oscillators or as many filters as you need will mean you'll either eventually run out and have to change your idea, or if you like the challenge, you'll find ways to use modules in ways that they weren't intended to be used. Quick example of that, just so that way you can know what we can get into in future videos where I deep dive on those topics specifically. If you didn't know this, you can actually use a slew limiter to act as a low pass filter, because it's going to do more or less the same thing. It will sound different because it's taking like a waveform and it's decreasing the amount of time it takes to get positive and negative, right? So say you had a square wave, right? If you have a slew limiter, reducing the time it takes to go positive, it's going to make that spike straight line go like this. And same with the other direction, if you have it slewing both up and down. So then you end up getting a triangle wave, which is basically the same as reducing the harmonic overtones from a square to a triangle, because a triangle is actually the harmonic series of a square. It's just the first 3 harmonics being turned down at a much steeper slope. But anyway, that's gonna have to be saved for a video specifically on those topics. That was a little mini rant about how much fun we're gonna have when we get into modular synthesis in future videos, so stay tuned. Make sure to subscribe so that way you get notified when those videos come out. It also helps if you like and all that stuff that everyone says, whatever. Alright, see you later.